2023 will likely go down as one of the best years for video game releases, and that's especially true for dungeon crawlers. 2023 saw new entries in some of the most important dungeon crawling series of all time. There were dozens of surprising indie dungeon RPGs to play, and several larger publishers released awesome new games inspired by old school favorites. Even games we wouldn't normally label as dungeon crawlers featured amazing dungeons that rivaled the designs of traditional dungeon crawling games. The point is, just about every corner of the medium featured some of the best dungeon crawling I've seen in ages. So today, I want to reflect on the noteworthy new releases, industry events, and trends of 2023 that prove, at least to me, that we are in a new dungeon crawler golden era. And we'll touch on some of my personal favorite games of the year along the way. Keep in mind, I'm just one dude with very little free time, so if I didn't include a game you enjoyed in 2023 in this massive roundup, be sure to shout it out in the comments so other folks can check it out. Anyway, we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive in. I'm going to kick off this overview of 2023 with what I think is the most logical starting point: Diablo IV. Dungeon crawlers come in many styles, but as I've said before on this channel, Diablo and Diablo-style isometric action RPGs are arguably what the general gaming public probably thinks of when they first hear dungeon crawler, and with good reason. Diablo has dominated the genre ever since the original release in 1996, and each subsequent release has expanded the series' audience. So it's no wonder that Diablo IV was one of the most anticipated games of the year by everybody. So, did it deliver? Well, it depends on who you ask. The initial reviews were generally high, and at least anecdotally speaking, the buzz I saw on social media was pretty positive. Post-launch though, things have been rocky, to say the least. As for me, I've had very little hands-on time with this one, essentially just the public play tests held over the summer leading up to launch. I never actually purchased or played the final full game. That's not because I think Diablo IV was bad, mind you. The few hours I spent with the game felt great to play. I love the return to the grim aesthetic, and I find the concept of expanding Diablo's formula into a persistent open-world MMO light to be an interesting one. Problem is, I learned a few years ago that I simply do not have the time or the desire to keep up with live service games or MMOs with battle passes and constant seasonal updates designed to keep you playing that one specific game for as long as possible. And that's very much the direction that Blizzard has taken with Diablo IV. So, for the first time ever, I skipped a new Diablo game. And that feels kind of weird. And it seems like I'm not alone in that. Some reviewers found many issues with this new approach to the Diablo formula as well, and even fans who were initially sold on the idea have turned on the game in the weeks and months after launch. Now, obviously, don't take my opinions on the game too seriously here. Just about any other publication, podcast, YouTube channel that covers Diablo IV will be a better source on this than me, and if you love the game, that's awesome. I think that's great. Different gameplay systems and designs appeal to different people for different reasons, and I'm not trying to change anyone's minds here. But the reason I'm talking about Diablo IV as part of this roundup is because I believe it represents a microcosm of AAA game development as a whole. If there is one word I would use to describe my feelings about video games in 2023, it would actually be conflicted. Sure, it was an outstanding year for new video game releases, dungeon crawlers or otherwise. One of the best ever, in fact. But if you follow just about any other games media outlet or YouTube channel, then you already know the industry itself had it rough over the last 12 months. There were constant sweeping layoffs and studio closures, not to mention even more reports of exploitative and even abusive working conditions coming to light. Games were shut down left and right, or outright canceled unceremoniously. Questionable and unappealing monetization tactics just became more prevalent than ever. It just wasn't a great year for the industry. Now, these issues aren't unique to 2023, but the year is by far the worst we've seen yet. And it's all because budgets continue to balloon, putting pressure on studios to shoot for unrealistic and unsustainable goals. So how does this factor into Diablo IV? Well, there's no denying that some of the biggest news stories of 2023 dealt with the mixed buzz around Diablo IV's post-launch. While that doesn't necessarily reflect on dungeon crawling as a subgenre per se, It's nevertheless notable for folks who enjoy this subgenre of games because the biggest dungeon crawler of 2023 is one of the best examples of the issues plaguing AAA development in general. And so far, it seems like Diablo IV is struggling to hit the mark to retain its player base. Some players have certainly stuck with the game through its uneven first few seasons, but many have dropped it to find their dungeon crawling fix elsewhere. Luckily, as we're about to talk about next, 2023 had a whole lot of great options to fill that void. Alright, sorry to start off with the dour note, but now we can move on to the more positive points. And this first one is pretty exciting. Perhaps the most unexpected dungeon crawling surprise of 2023 was the modest renaissance we saw for Wizardry and Wizardry-like dungeon crawlers. Longtime viewers of the channel know I'm a huge fan of the great granddaddy of first-person dungeon RPGs and the many games that take direct inspiration from it. And while these games have always been around, especially in Japan, the folks at Digital Eclipse shocked us all when the studio announced a remake of the original Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, which features a modernized coat of paint and streamlined controls and menus while preserving the original hardcore RPG's spirit. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, chances are you saw how excited I was for this when it was first announced. Since then, I've played several hours of the early access builds after it dropped back in September. While I'm holding off for the full release to offer my full thoughts, so far I think it's promising, barring some early access jank, and I'm confident it could shape up pretty well. If nothing else, it makes the original Wizardry easily accessible and could introduce people to the Wizardry series and to first-person dungeon RPGs in general, and as someone who loves this series and this style of game, that's pretty exciting. The Wizardry 1 remake was not the only Wizardry game we got in 2023, however. On the Japanese side of the franchise, Wizardry, The Five Ordeals, finally left early access on Steam with a complete English localization, as well as a DLC pack that adds an English translation of the previously Japan-only PS2 game, Wizardry Prisoners of the Battles. It's rebuilt entirely in the Five Ordeals engine. Publisher GameSpark also announced The Five Ordeals and its new DLC will launch on the Nintendo Switch in the future, likely sometime in 2024. Similarly, the upcoming Wizardry game for smartphones, Wizardry Variants Daphne, showed off plenty of new footage with new trailers throughout the year, culminating in a Japan-exclusive playtest. Now, it sounds like post-play test survey responses were more negative than publisher Drecom and developer Studio 2 Pro expected, but to the development team's credit, they say they're taking the fan feedback to heart and are working to improve the game to match fan expectations as work continues into 2024. While Wizardry itself saw a small comeback this year, it was arguably an even bigger year for Wizardry-inspired dungeon RPGs, with several larger publishers releasing titles based on the tried-and-true Wizardry formula with their own twists. Most notably, Atlas finally dropped HD remasters of the first three Etrian Odyssey games with the Etrian Odyssey Origins HD collection on Nintendo Switch and Steam. Sega sent me a code for all three earlier in the year, and I found the up-res visuals and enhanced soundtrack to be awesome. Couple all that with the new difficulty settings and the overhauled in-game map-making controls, and this makes the HD ports one of the best ways to get into the series, and will likely be my go-to suggestion for folks looking to try hardcore dungeon RPGs for the first time. Other big publisher highlights include Labyrinth of Galleria: The Moon Society, which is the follow-up to NIS and Nippon Ichi Japan's Labyrinth of Refrain: Coven of Dusk from a few years ago. Like Refrain, Galleria offers a heavier focus on narrative alongside its signature large party dungeon crawling, and features the quirky art style and general vibe of the studio's Disgaea series. Acquire also brought over the English localization of Labyrinth of Zangetsu, which is a DRPG based on feudal Japan and Japanese folklore, featuring a striking monochrome ink wash visual style. I didn't get to play this one, but it did get a positive review from fellow dungeon crawler liker Above Up, so be sure to check out his video if you're interested. Then, Experience Inc., the same folks behind the excellent DRPG Undernaut's Labyrinth of Yomi and Stranger in Sword City, dropped their latest dungeon crawler titled, bear with me here, Manu, defeat monsters and gain strong weapons and armor. You may be defeated, but don't give up. Become stronger. I believe there will be a day when the heroes defeat the Devil King. Yeah, that's the whole title, though most folks just call it Manu for short. This one is pretty standard. In fact, the title does a really good job of explaining exactly what Manu is. But if you like Experience's previous output or any of the other titles I've mentioned in this section, it's worth checking out on PC, Switch, and PlayStation. So it's surprising we got this many Japanese DRPGs localized in North America in 2023. That said, the truly interesting Wizardry likes for me were from the indie scene. For example, if you're looking for a quick DRPG fix on PC and the Etrian Odyssey Steam ports weren't enough for you, Core Crossing from solo dev and friend of the channel, Non-Kata Games, will likely fit the bill. The game calls out Etrian Odyssey as a direct influence, and it's obvious in the game's gameplay loop and dungeon designs. Its combat, however, is an iteration on Non-Kata's Shin Megami Tensei-inspired dungeon crawler Advent Crossroads, so it's heavily based on elemental weaknesses and status effects, and I think it's awesome. I actually like aspects of Core Crossing's combat better than Etrian Odyssey's more old-school battle system. Then, the two-man indie team Grave Robber Foundation dropped their latest dungeon RPG, Demon Lord Reincarnation, on PC and PlayStation. This one features unique party building and character progression systems that are almost closer to the Saga series, or even Pokemon in some ways. I'll have a lot more to say about this one in 2024. For now, it's definitely a high recommendation for me. And then we have my absolute favorite indie dungeon RPG and maybe my favorite dungeon crawler of the whole year, Path of the Abyss. I've had my eye on this one for a long time, ever since the art style and music caught my attention on Twitter a couple years ago. And it finally released on Steam in late December 2023, just a few days ago. It's likely some of my positivity about this game is due to recency bias, but I really think this one is special. The art and the music hit just as hard as expected, but the combat and skill system are where Path of the Abyss shines for me. Combat plays out in a semi-automated, real-time fashion with skill cooldowns. Each round of combat progresses automatically, and you select which skills will activate in real time. Think Loop Hero meets dungeon encounters, and you get kinda close. The abilities your party can use in battle are placed on a grid from each character's pool of skills, which are learned by leveling up or from the gear your character has equipped. And since loot is plentiful and so far has quite a lot of variety, there's always new skills to try out. Skills can also synergize or affect others based on where you activate them. It's surprisingly deep. One thing to note though, Steam says the game is only in Japanese, but that is not true. It's technically fully playable in English. The current version features machine-translated menus. However, the proper English localization is being worked on during the early access period, along with some extra endgame content and general bug fixes and balance tweaks. There are some awkward phrases and spots, but I haven't run into any issues at all, and the game is content complete otherwise. Seriously, if you have any interest in this, I highly recommend going and playing it right now. Haven't had enough recommendations from this video yet? Well, good news. There were a bunch of other indie dungeon crawlers beyond the standard Wizardry-like fare, many of which made a strong impression on me or the wider gaming audience. Here are just a small selection of a few of my favorites. Touhou Artificial Dream in Arcadia is a wonderful homage to the original Shin Megami Tensei dungeon RPGs. Islands of the Caliph melded the real-time dungeon crawling of Eye of the Beholder with the overworld and quest design of early Elder Scrolls titles. Legends of Amberlands 2 continued the series' faithful yet approachable take on Might and Magic's world-crawling blobber formula. Moonring is a top-down RPG designed by Dean Carter, co-creator of the Fable series. Its visuals and gameplay are a clear homage to Ultima, with a dash of Rogue, but its old-school presentation is as polished as any high-quality indie game from 2023, and is buttressed by tiny details like dynamic lighting and animation flourishes one expects from modern games. And Gloomgrave from Studio Netmancer is a colorful and fast first-person roguelike that seems to carry the legacy of the early 90s classic Dungeon Hack. I should really also highlight Quester. This was another of the many excellent Japanese dungeon crawlers localized in English this year. It's also extremely hard to describe in just a few sentences. It's a simple looking game on the surface, but there's actually a lot going on in this survival roguelike dungeon crawler. Manga artist Kazushi Hagawara is the mastermind behind this one, best known as the character designer behind Final Fantasy XI's Geomancer and Rune Fencer jobs, which that should immediately grant it entry on your backlog. Questor is just one of a handful of experimental dungeon crawlers from this year that took established tropes and mechanics of the dungeon crawling subgenre and modified or combined them to create a new novel take on this style of game. Some others worth checking out are the roguelite crawler meets tower defense RPG Endless Dungeon, Bleak Sword, which is a stylish and challenging hack and slash with a totally rad low-bit visual style. Backpack Hero takes one of the most tedious aspects of any RPG, inventory management, and turns it into the core gameplay mechanic where your character's skills, items, and buffs depend on how you arrange the items in your backpack. Trust me, it's super smart and a ton of fun. And Darkest Dungeon 2, which is branching away from the traditional dungeon crawling of the first game and reimagines the gameplay loop as a gothic fantasy road trip. I could sit here listing awesome 2023 games all day, but I also want to briefly shout out some much older games, namely a selection of Japan-exclusive dungeon crawler RPGs from the 1990s that finally received English patches in 2023, including Dungeon Master Nexus for Sega Saturn, Mado Monogatari for the PC 98, and both the Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1 versions of the original Baroque, which is one of my personal favorite dungeon crawlers of all time. Fan patches are no easy task and are done purely out of passion. They're also crucially important for preservation and help players experience games they might not have otherwise, so I am deeply grateful to all of the teams that worked so hard on these translations. Link to the English patches for all 3 games will be listed down in the description. If you'll allow me to step slightly outside the bounds of what we normally think of dungeon crawlers for a moment, there's some other dungeon crawling adjacent games I want to touch on. One style of hardcore RPG that we saw a lot of in 2023 were Soulslikes, though not from the genre's progenitors From Software, who instead released the absolutely stellar Armored Core 6. Currently, however, the studio is hard at work on the Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. Luckily, a bunch of other studios picked up the slack in their absence. Respawn Entertainment continued its Souls-flavored Star Wars series with Jedi Survivor. Fans resonated with Remnant 2's semi-proc-gen multiplayer shooter take on the formula. The Lords of the Fallen reboot amped up Dark Souls' gothic horror art direction and labyrinthine level design to new extremes, and then added a whole world-switching mechanic reminiscent of Soul Reaver. And Team Ninja mixed its successful Neo blueprint with Sekiro's focus on stealth and speed, then applied that gameplay formula to Chinese folklore with Wolong Fallen Dynasty. However, it was Round 8 Studios' Lies of P that proved to be the surprise Souls-like hit of 2023, featuring aggressive combat reminiscent of Bloodborne and a striking dark fantasy steampunk take on Pinocchio of all things. Some fans and critics even laud Lies of P as the first Souls-like to truly live up to or even surpass the quality of From Software's output. That's big praise. Unfortunately, though, I wouldn't know. Lies of P is one of the many games that I missed out on in 2023. In fact, I didn't get to any of the Souls-likes I just mentioned. Nevertheless, this bevy of dungeon crawling adjacent, hardcore action RPGs is evidence of the Souls-like subgenre's continued popularity. And I believe the enduring acceptance of games like this by the mainstream audience is why we've seen a renewed interest in dungeon crawlers of all styles lately, and in 2023 especially. Now you might be thinking, Brendan, you love Dark Souls and From Software. Why didn't you play any of these awesome Souls-likes? Well, for one thing, as I've mentioned a few times already, there were too many good games this year. It just wasn't possible to play everything I wanted to. The other thing is, I actually did play a number of FromSoft-inspired action RPGs. They just weren't inspired by Dark Souls, but rather the studio's older dark fantasy dungeon crawlers, Kingsfield and Shadow Tower. Shocker, I know. As I've discussed quite a bit on this channel and in written articles at places like GameSpot, we've seen a fair number of Kingsfield-likes over the last couple of years, if you want to call them that. But the one I've been most looking forward to was Lunacid. The game was in early access for a couple of years, but it finally released in 1.0 on Halloween 2023. I interviewed the game's developer, Akuma Kira, just days before the final build launched to get more insight in the game, so check out the links below to check that out. As for my thoughts on Lunasid, I think the game gets closer to the atmosphere and spirit of games like Kingsfield and Shadow Tower than just about any other recent game of this style. It's definitely a vibes-first experience, but you know what, so are most of my favorite games, and it's impressive how well Kira managed to craft a world that is simultaneously dangerous and unsettling, but also just fun to explore and exist in. That is not an easy balance to strike, and Lunasid manages to pull it off in ways that solidified it as one of my favorite games of 2023. Lunasid rules, but it's not the only game I played this year that's taking cues from Kingsfield. One I particularly enjoyed was Fly Night, which is a first-person dungeon crawler where you play as a fly wearing armor, slinking through caves and catacombs filled with other enemy bugs carrying swords. It's a really neat idea, very fun aesthetic. I also want to shout out Legend of the Blue Sword. This is a first-person action-adventure Metroidvania dungeon crawl with retro 3D aesthetic that mixes low-poly environments, chunky textures, and billboarded sprites like classic 90s games. Both Fly Night and Legend of the Blue Sword are short adventures you can beat in one setting. We're talking less than 10 minutes for Blue Sword and around half an hour for Fly Night. And they're both free on itch.io, so there's no reason not to check them out. Okay, so far, we've looked mostly at games resurrecting old gameplay styles or iterating on established subgenres. But I want to move on to a huge trend from 2023 that I just didn't see coming at all. The rise of extraction dungeon crawlers. Good old Tarkov. The extraction shooter's influence has mainly touched FPSs, survival games, and even a few action RPGs at this point, but 2023 saw 3 major projects go public that meld the slow, punishing first-person dungeoneering of Kingsfield with the player versus environment loot-grabbing structure of extraction shooters. The first, and arguably most notorious, was Dark and Darker. The game's initial public tests drew a huge base of players and dominated the Twitch viewership early in the year. But just as it was gaining traction, the game was pulled from Steam due to legal disputes between the game's developer Iron Mace and publisher Nexon. To be clear, Nexon is not involved in Dark and Darker's development or its publishing. However, members of Iron Mace had worked at Nexon previously, and Nexon claims Dark and Darker's concept, design, and even certain art assets were lifted from an unannounced internal project that's currently in development. Nexon was so serious about the allegations that it filed a DMCA takedown to remove the game from Steam, along with a copyright infringement lawsuit in the US. Iron Mace denies the allegations and argues that a game's concept and genre cannot be copyrighted, even though that kinda sounds like they're acknowledging that they got the idea while working at Nexon. Anyway, the thing is, even if they did, you can't copyright a game's concept, and the lawsuit was dismissed in August. Nevertheless, the game remains unavailable on Steam, though you can buy and play it via Iron Mace's official website. It's a whole messy affair that surely harmed Dark and Darker's early momentum, but it remains popular with its player base. For my money, I think Dark and Darker's concept is a great one. I played it a bit, both with friends and solo, and I definitely think that there's something to this. It was also very early and janky, and frankly, some of that art is just a little dodgy, as are some of the monetization methods the team has tested out. But keep in mind, I also haven't checked out the latest builds. I'm waiting to see how the final release turns out. For now, at least, I can say I enjoyed playing with my friends when I did, and I think the entire concept of a team-based extraction dungeon crawler is actually amazing. And it seems like a lot of other developers noticed there's a lot of potential there too. A small batch of copycats sprung up in the wake of Dark and Darker's overnight success and subsequent removal from Steam. Notably, Greed is Good and Project Crawl, not affiliated with this channel in any way. Greed is Good is available in early access, but critical response is mixed so far. Project Crawl, on the other hand, has only had a few playtests and its release date is still TBA. At the time of recording, I haven't played either. Both look extremely similar to Dark and Darker, however, which makes me wonder if there's enough space in this burgeoning subgenre to support this many nearly identical games. And that's not counting the fourth potential competitor from Nexon, and I'm sure there are more likely to sprout up in the future as well, hopefully with a slightly more original take on the gameplay loop and the aesthetics especially. I'll be keeping my eye on this because I'm curious to see how this saga plays out. But for now, I don't have a dog in this race. In the meantime, however, if you're looking for a good co-op multiplayer permadeath dungeon crawl to play on Steam, maybe check out Barony. However, if you're open to a slightly different presentation and camera angle and a single-player experience, I would highly recommend Exanima, as well as the demo for the upcoming game Spark in the Dark. While these isometric single-player dungeon crawlers won't scratch the first-person multiplayer itch, their dark fantasy aesthetics, loot-focused gameplay loop, slow, deliberate melee combat, and unforgiving difficulty are a lot of fun, and I think get closest to Dark and Darker's tone and challenge of any of the games I've mentioned so far. Obviously, 2023 was packed with awesome dungeon crawlers, new and old. But that's not the only reason I think this year was such a big deal for us dungeon sickos out there and the types of games we play. Other games dropped this year that we wouldn't normally call, quote, dungeon crawlers, yet they featured surprisingly great dungeon crawling sections. In some cases, they even outdid the more traditional dungeon crawlers at their own game. One such game was Sea of Stars. This charming top-down RPG is inspired by classic console RPGs like Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, and Super Mario RPG. The combat is fun and engaging, the art style is gorgeous, and the soundtrack, which is co-composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, who also composed Xenoblade and the Chrono series, is outstanding. My overall thoughts on the game are maybe a little bit more mixed, but nevertheless, the reason it's getting a shout out here is because of its dungeons, which feature puzzles, layouts, and even platforming elements that you wouldn't normally see in a game like this. I've seen a lot of comparisons to the dungeons in Golden Sun and 2D Legend of Zelda titles, but I also find a lot of similarities to Lufia 2 and Shining the Holy Ark. Baldur's Gate 3 also has plenty of dungeons to explore, fitting given the game's D&D foundation. While some of the dungeons, caves, and other underworld sections can be appropriately difficult to fight and survive through, Baldur's Gate 3 is not exactly what I'd call a dungeon crawler. Nevertheless, Larian Studios crafted some of the most memorable dungeons of 2023. Not only are these subterranean zones visually striking, but they also feature the same sprawling narrative design and player-centric creative problem solving as the rest of the game. Now, at least speaking personally, narrative and character relationships aren't things I'm looking for from a dungeon crawler. I'm there to fight, explore, loot, maybe solve a few puzzles, but not much else. Honestly, that's kind of how I am about most games. And yet, even I can't deny the staggering achievements in narrative design Larian CRPG achieves. Now, you'll have to forgive me, I am intentionally keeping this section short and vague so as not to spoil the stories and questlines found in Baldur's Gate 3's dungeons. But it would also be fair to say that the way I solve these will be entirely different, probably, than everyone else. And I highly encourage fans of games, both video games and tabletop games, to play Baldur's Gate 3 if you haven't yet. Beyond RPGs, there were also a bunch of excellent dungeon crawling adjacent games like System Shock Remake, Metroid Prime Remastered, Wizardom, Blasphemous 2, and Pseudo Regalia, which is a 3D platforming Metroidvania set in a giant interconnected dungeon. All of these games feature amazing dungeons or dungeon-like environments and level designs that are a joy to explore. Heck, even Pikmin 4 got in on the dungeon crawling by bringing back caves. While Pikmin 4's caves feature mostly bespoke layouts and curated challenges compared to Pikmin 2's almost mystery dungeon-esque designs, they were still plenty tough and were easily some of my favorite sections of the game. However, of all the games in 2023 that featured some form of dungeon crawling, there's only one that I think truly pushed the concept of dungeon crawling forward in an exciting and unexpected way. Compared to the last game in the series, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom features a surprising amount of dungeon crawling. The overworld features hidden caves, the giant mazes of Breath of the Wild make a return and feature fun new gameplay twists, and there are even a handful of temples in the game that mix the traditional puzzle boxes and combat gauntlets of earlier Zelda titles with the open-ended design of Breath of the Wild's divine beasts. Not to mention several zones leading up to those temples that feature more directed quests and puzzle design more akin to those older Zelda games. But if you've played Tears of the Kingdom, you know there's another portion of the game that feels more like a dungeon crawl than, honestly, any other part of any Zelda game that's come before it, and that's the underground chasms. Now, before I discuss the game's underground zone, I should probably mention that Tears of the Kingdom is my personal game of the year. Probably not a surprise to folks who have watched my other videos or appearances on podcasts where I have listed Breath of the Wild as one of my favorite games ever made. But I'll be honest, the opening hours of Tears of the Kingdom had me, well, conflicted, to call back to the theme of this year as a whole. The opening moments exploring the ruins with Zelda are great, I love that. But this game's starting zone, I didn't care for it. I definitely prefer Breath of the Wild's Great Plateau, with its open-ended design, hands-off guidance letting you tackle its opening hours in your own way, versus Tears of the Kingdom's more directed and restrictive Sky Island tutorial section. In fact, that's how I feel about these two games overall. Breath of the Wild's simplicity, quiet ambience, and openness appeal to me and my sensibilities more, and overall I prefer Breath of the Wild as an experience to Tears of the Kingdom. But I do believe Tears of the Kingdom is ultimately the better game, if that makes sense. Anyway, the point is, for about the first, 4 or 5 hours, I wasn't clicking with Tears of the Kingdom the way I thought I would. And then I found a massive hole in the ground, and I did the only thing a sensible person would do in such a situation. I jumped in. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but I was shocked by what I discovered. It was a pitch black realm that seemed to be just as open as Hyrule itself. If you haven't played Tears of the Kingdom and haven't heard about the underground zones, let me fill you in. This massive map measures almost the same size and scale as the main Hyrule overworld in total. However, it's segmented into a handful of smaller, walled-in chasms. The world down here is pitch black, but you can illuminate the environment with torches, glowing plant seeds called Bright Bloom Seeds, or by activating giant light roots that fill your map and shine the light far into the distance. The underground looks and feels unlike anything else in the game. The plant life looks almost alien in design, and the rock formations have an unsettling, organic quality to them. Everything is murky blues, purples, grays, and greens, and even a fully illuminated section will be choked by haze and fog. Just like the main overworld, there are tons of things to do and discover, from enemy encampments to deadly optional bosses to ruins hiding useful treasure and creepy living statues that ask you to collect the many souls of the dead wandering the underground. But while the depths are aesthetically and conceptually captivating, the gameplay mechanics are what really appeal to my dungeon crawling sensibilities. It's also where many of the survival elements I loved in Breath of the Wild make their return, and often with increased intensity. Not only do you have to navigate around the pitch black terrain, but the hazards down here are far more unforgiving. Enemies in the underground hit hard, and their attacks will temporarily reduce your maximum health. Same goes for the pools and rivers of gloom. Walking over this inky purple Ganon goop will also chip away your max hearts, and hearts lost to gloom can only be restored by standing under a light root or by cooking and eating a meal with special restorative properties. Add in the weapon durability from both of these games, which I personally have always loved, and suddenly exploring and surviving in this pitch black, super deadly zone filled with monsters and lost souls feels more like an open world shadow tower than what we'd normally expect from a Zelda game. Alright, I've rambled enough about what Tears of the Kingdom's underground depths are and why I love them. I could go on much longer, but this video is already long enough, so I'll get to the actual point here. The reason Tears of the Kingdom is getting such a long segment in this video about dungeon crawlers isn't just because it's my favorite game of the year. It's also not on here because I'm trying to convince folks it's secretly the best dungeon crawler of the year. It certainly appeals to things I like from specific dungeon crawlers, but I am not making that stretch of an argument. It's on this list because of what I think the Underground Depths zones could mean for dungeon crawlers going forward. It's remarkable that Tears of the Kingdom managed to create an oppressive underground zone that offers the same risk and reward gameplay loops that draw me to hardcore dungeon crawlers and the open-ended sense of exploration and discovery of the main overworld at the same time. The darkness and shadow forces players to engage with their surroundings in an entirely new way, while still creating a sense of awe and vastness, even with everything shrouded in darkness and haze. The only game I can think that's gotten close is Dragon's Dogma during the nighttime sections, but even that is a very different experience. And I can't help but imagine a game that took that idea and ran with it, set in an entirely dark, deadly underground dungeon world where tiny glints of light highlight the face of ruins in the distance, enticing you to explore deeper into the engulfing blackness. One that ramps up the challenge and injects more hardcore RPG systems, party building, mechanics, tinkering, everything that we would expect from a good dungeon crawler. Something tells me I'm not the only person who sees the potential and possibility in Tears of the Kingdom's depths, and I'm hopeful and excited to see the impact this could have on dungeon crawlers and just video games in general. And hey, even if no game like that ever comes to fruition, I can always load up Tears of the Kingdom and enjoy exploring the depths all over again. And with that, friends, we have covered all the major dungeon crawling games, trends, and events of 2023, or at least the ones that stuck with me the most. Before we wrap up entirely, and in lieu of a proper Game of the Year video, I'm going to post a list of my top 10 games on screen for you in case you're curious, since this video is already focused on the last year of gaming in general. Starting at number 10, we have Pikmin 4, 9 is Blasphemous 2, 8, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, 7, Baldur's Gate 3, 6, System Shock Remake, 5, Resident Evil 4 Remake, 4, Street Fighter 6, 3, Metroid Prime Remastered, 2, Armored Core 6, Fires of Rubicon, and number 1, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Now, that's not as exciting as a dedicated Game of the Year list, I know, but hey, if you want to hear me talk about several of the games on this list in more detail, I guested on the VGA Apocalypse 2-part Game of the Year special. Go check it out, give it a listen. I had a great time recording with those guys. It was a lot of fun. And since we're all focused on dungeon crawlers around here, here's another list, this time, of my top 10 dungeon crawlers of the year. Starting number 10 is Core Crossing, 9 is Gloomgrave, 8 is the Wizardry Remake, 7, Moonring, 6, Islands of the Caliph, 5, Demon Lord Reincarnation, 4, Quester, 3 is Lunacid, 2 is the Etrian Odyssey HD Origins Collection, and once again, my number 1 dungeon crawler of 2023 is Path of the Abyss. Whew, okay, we did it. We got through all of it. 2023 is now closed, done and dusted, on the books, in the rear view mirror, all that good stuff. We can finally move on to 2024, and man, I am so excited about a lot of games coming out this year. We got Dragon's Dogma 2, Shiren the Wanderer 6, we got Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Visions of Mana, Grand Blue Fantasy Relink. Just so many great games already scheduled to look forward to for 2024. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching and listening. This is a new experimental take on the Game of the Year format for this channel, and it was just something I really felt like checking out, so I appreciate you guys sticking with me. At the time of recording, we just passed 5K subscribers on this channel, and I'm really grateful. I've got several projects already in the works for 2024, big videos, small videos, everything in between, and I'm really excited to share that with you guys soon. Huge thanks, of course, to my Patreon and Ko-Fi supporters who got to see this video a few days early and get to hang out with me over on Discord. Links down in the description if you want to check out more about that. For now, though, that's it for me. I will be back soon with another video. Until then, I hope you had a great 2023, and I hope 2024 is off to an amazing start. I'll talk to you all again very soon.